one of the things that I encounter all the time when I report for BBC Look North, but also present a program called Politics North, is politicians telling me that we need green jobs, that green jobs are the future. When you dig down a little bit into the where are those green jobs, what are they, how are they going to be created, the answers get a little bit hazier. So perhaps this will help us as we go through this event today. And certainly from the government's 10-point plan to Labour's Green New Deal, there's an agreement across the political spectrum, of course, beyond that as well, that green jobs represent a future, that even pre-pandemic, obviously, that they were about replacing jobs perhaps in traditional industries that had declined and industries that are going to be affected by a low carbon economy, but also, obviously, post-pandemic, they could provide an answer in communities where jobs could well be lost because of the fallout from COVID-19. And indeed, in my area, of course, that's the other thing that gets talked about, of course, that the North East in particular of England, needs these green jobs, that we are an economy that's underperformed, that these offer a future down the road in Tees Valley. We've got plans for developing hydrogen, for carbon capture, for wind turbine manufacture. It's seen very much as part of also, of course, this levelling up agenda, that green jobs will provide part of an answer for left behind communities to catch up. And we want to explore through this event a little bit of that overlap between creating green jobs and what it could mean for economies like the North East, but also other parts of Britain, of course, that feel that this is an opportunity to perhaps to really capitalise on something that can boost an economy that perhaps is lagged behind other parts of the country. But also want to look at, who is going to do these green jobs? What are they exactly? And whether people are willing and able to go into them, and how secure otherwise they will be, because they don't just, of course, rely on the vagaries of the economy, but also often on government policy and investment. Witness what happened, of course, to the solar panel industry. So we've got three fantastic panellists who we'll introduce in a moment, who will open up our discussions, and we'll discuss with them, and you'll be able to also get a chance to ask them questions. There is a Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of the screen there for asking questions. Feel free to add those in there. If you see a question in there you like the look of as well, and you think they've got the question that I want to ask, then you can upvote those so that they're more likely to be asked when we get to the end of our panel discussion and we get to those Q&As. And heaven forbid someone might have asked a better question you've come up with. Feel free to upvote it so that we can talk to. We can put those to the panellists. There's also a chat function on there where you're welcome to talk to each other, swap numbers, whatever you want to do, but don't put questions in there because that's not being monitored for those questions. Only the questions that go into the Q&A will appear later and be used. So our three panellists are Rachel Wolfe from Public First, Mika Minio from the TOC, and Sam Alvis from Green Alliance itself. So let's hear from all three of them initially. Now, Rachel from Public First has got authored the Conservative Party's 2019 election manifesto. Previously, has been an innovation and education advisor to David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. I also founded the New Schools Network, and has also completed some recent research for Green Alliance about green jobs, and particularly the attitude of people who might want to get these green jobs and what they think about them. Rachel.
Good afternoon. And I know that the research we did with the Green Alliance has just been made public today, so I hope you all get a chance to read it. But I'm just going to go through a couple of the main findings, because as Richard said, it's not a coincidence that politicians have focused on green jobs as they've talked about reaching net zero, because they know that it is one of the most compelling and popular ways to talk to the public, and particularly people who are in slightly more working class communities, people who are in the kind of new electoral landscape that we all talk about, is to talk about green jobs. And what we wanted to understand through the focus groups that we did is, what do people actually understand by that? What are they interested in? What might actually persuade them to do these jobs? What is it that people who are involved in government policy or in communicating net zero and the green economy need to know? So the first thing to say, and we know this from other opinion research as well, is that people are genuinely committed to the environment and environmental change, and they're excited by it. And that is true across classes and ages and geographies. But their knowledge is very, very low. Their knowledge of the specifics is low, and their knowledge of the terminology is almost non-existent. So most people will not be able to tell you what net zero means. They certainly won't be able to tell you what the green economy is, and they're very, very vague about what a green job might be. They don't know what this is. And then the second thing to say is there is some nervousness about taking what they would call a punt on jobs that they're not quite sure whether they're going to appear, and crucially, to Richard's point, might disappear if government funding goes. Security is an absolutely core and unsurprising concern for people as they're thinking about jobs. So that's the sort of downside. On the upside, there is genuine enthusiasm once green jobs are explained, and we talked through some in the circular economy and other areas, that there is genuine enthusiasm and a true sense that these jobs have some elevated status beyond other jobs because they are contributing to improving the environment for people's children and grandchildren. So there is definitely an opportunity there. People are also post-COVID more interested in thinking about questions like work-life balance, meaning what is it that I'm doing with my job and my life, provided that it is within that frame of genuine security. The actual jobs that they are most interested in are almost always ones that are adjacent to their own current experience. So if, for example, they're in retail, they can imagine doing a job which is about used clothing or secondhand clothing or recycling clothing. It is much, much harder to get people to think of moving completely out of, say, manufacturing into another sector. So as we're thinking about green jobs and opportunity for people, we have to think about that adjacence. More than anything else, though, and then I'll stop because I know we want to get to the conversation as early as possible, I think the thing that I would stress is that the abstract nature with which we are currently talking about these opportunities, whether that is the government or people who are communicating and talking about this area more generally, is completely going above people's heads. They don't hear it. If they do hear it, they don't understand it, and they're much less likely to be excited by it than much more tangible and very, very concrete offers. And of course, at the end of the day, in 5 years or 10 years, when governments, politicians go back to the public, they are going to notice whether they're employed or not and in which job. And so that tangibility really matters. We made a number of policy recommendations in the report, basically around that, in terms of creating both new institutional and individual funding and support to increase the level of security in terms of people going into green jobs and getting the relevant skills to do so, but also in terms of providing a framework and really close matching to what jobs it is that you want people to be going into and communicating that and demonstrating how they get from their current jobs to it. I think without that, it is plausible that these promises are going to end up sort of dissipating. So I think it's really interesting research. I guess I would say that. I think it's worth reading. And I think there's a lot to act on for people who are in this area. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Rachel. I just want to ask one quick question before we move on to the panel sub-bread research, which is fascinating. And it really shows it's a kind of disconnect, I suppose, between the language used by politicians on green jobs and what's the understanding often is amongst the people who they want to get into these sectors. I mean, what can politicians do you think, to try and get over this barrier, really, that's created between the people who need to do these jobs, who want to do these jobs, who want the opportunity to have these jobs, and the politicians just talking vaguely about green jobs and zero.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think there's a policy gap and there's a communications gap. So let me talk about the policy gap briefly first. I mean, first of all, we are waiting for quite a lot of policy and strategy to come out of the government about how they're actually going to deliver on all these jobs. So there's just a kind of general, like, what exactly are we talking about? And when you kind of dig under the 10-point plan, there obviously are construction jobs and others, but it's still quite high level when you look at the kind of modelling that underpins those 10-point plan promises. So there's just some general policy about the actual transition to a net zero economy that's needed. Then underneath that, I think there is a lot that needs to happen in terms of the local skills plans that the government is going to be putting in place across the country, including the combined mayoral authorities, in terms of working with job centres to support people in terms of retraining, in terms of working with universities and colleges about the courses they do. There's just a lot more that they could be doing in terms of putting tangibility around actually how you train and get into these jobs. Those are the policy gaps. And then the communications gaps, I think that we need to start talking intangible. So we need to have a list of the top 10 jobs that we want people to be going into in each area and talking in terms of those jobs rather than just a general green economy. That doesn't mean anything to anyone. And that is hard until those policy buckets are in place. But until then, you shouldn't expect anyone to do anything.
Sure, thank you very much. Okay, well, let's introduce our second panelist today. It's Mika Minio, and she leads on climate and industry for the TUC and also is a consultant with transition economics, an architect of Labour's green industrial revolution policies between 2017 and 2019, and has run climate and energy related projects for the last 15 years, looking very much between the links between green work and good jobs, good works. Mika.
Thanks, yeah, thanks for having me. And it was great to speak after Rachel, and very much agree with the points about tangibility and making good green jobs actually a reality. A lot of the work that we've done recently has been with the government's Green Jobs Task Force and through the task force, which is currently finalising its recommendations, hopefully will come out soon. And I guess the key, that task force was set up partly because of a recognition that green jobs haven't been created at the scale that was promised by a range of governments. Of all parties. Like, we've repeatedly been told there will be a horizon, we're coming over the horizon, there's going to be all these many great good green jobs, and they just haven't materialized. And I think part of that comes back to this question, well, when will those policies be put into practice and at what scale? We put out some research just last week comparing G7 green recovery plans, different G7 countries, and given the language around climate leadership, you would expect the UK to be near the top of the league table of the G7. And actually, we came sixth. Only Japan was putting less money per person. So we obviously scaled it per person. We also scaled it by size of the economy. The UK came sixth. And if you look at how much is being spent per person in the 10-point plan, for example, that adds up to £180 per person over 10 years, £18 a year. Full-scale transformation of our economy, creating lots of jobs, £18 per person, just doesn't quite sync up, especially when you compare it to, let's say, Biden's new proposal in the US. That's £300 per person per year. Not enough for the climate transition we need to see, but it's a different level. Effectively, we need to see something more like 16 10-point plans, not one, but 16. The other side of the equation that we're looking at is it's not just about numbers of jobs. It's about quality of jobs, and it's really interesting seeing the research that Rachel has done, that Green Alliance has put out, and that people want good work. People want a successful climate transition. They believe in having a better environment and a kind of cleaner and safer world to live in, but they also want good work. And good work means a range of things. It means decent contracts, security, knowing when their hours will be, decent pay. Holidays means having some say in their workplace, being able to, be part of that, and also health and safety questions. And again, it's not that all green jobs are bad jobs. That is very much not the case. But there are a lot of quality concerns around quite a lot of green jobs, and I'm happy to come back into this in more detail later. But whether it's looking at retrofitting our homes, or heat pump installation, or nature restoration, or marine jobs in offshore wind, and there are issues at the moment. And until we address those and make sure that actually all green jobs are good jobs and quality jobs, we're going to struggle to deliver a successful climate transition. We're at risk of backlash, and ultimately we're not going to take the public with us and going, yes, I want these green jobs, because if they look like they're worse than the jobs they had before, or the jobs that used to be around, then it looks like it's an unhelpful transformation of our society. So I think that's the other part of how do we make it a reality that those green jobs are good. And I'll stop there so that we have more time for conversation.
I just want to ask you one quick question. In terms of getting green jobs at the moment, is the balance right as well? But obviously you talked about needing to be quality jobs, which obviously is important, but are green jobs really going to be for reskilling existing workers who might have fallen out of industries that perhaps have fallen foul of a zero carbon economy, or those new to the job market? Obviously unemployment is higher in those younger people who are just entering the job market, particularly at the moment because of the pandemic?
It shouldn't be an either or. It very definitely needs to be both. I think for a start, ideally, high carbon sectors should be transitioning, should be decarbonizing rather than closing. Now, obviously, some coal power stations just have to close. On the other hand, a steel plant, do we really want to go down the line where we close all steel plants in the UK and rely on importing clean steel from Sweden? Surely we can make clean steel here too. Do we really want to import all our electric vehicles from elsewhere, or can we retool our car factories here? Hopefully. At the same time, yes, we do need to create hundreds of thousands of jobs for particularly the young people, and we need a kind of ramping up of green apprenticeships, particularly for those folks who've been hit by the high levels of unemployment through COVID. And it's kind of balancing those alongside each other to make sure that we're maximizing protecting the skills that we already have in the workforce, because most of the people who will deliver the transition in the next 10 years are already in the workforce, while training up new people alongside it. It has to be both. I'd say the balance is not there at the moment, but that's largely because neither of them is happening at the scale required. They both need to ramp up.
Thank you. We've sent to all those issues. Now, our third panelist is Sam Alvis from Green Alliance. He leads on greening the economy for the organisation, focusing on putting climate and efforts to restore nature at the heart of our post-pandemic economic recovery. He's also a member of Chatham House's panel of young advisors. And before joining Green Alliance, was a senior advisor to Tony Blair and has worked for the Shadow Treasury team as well. Sam.
Thanks very much. So there's sort of three things I want to cover very briefly. Very simple questions of this question of like, what is a green job? Where are they going to be? And then potentially some thoughts on how we're going to get them. So I think we've talked a bit about tangibility so far, but I think one thing we need to agree on is what is the concept of a green job? Government, at least through the public statistics that the Department of Business puts out, takes quite a narrow view. They're talking about clean manufacturing, low carbon energy. There's others, perhaps the Green New Deal, perhaps NGOs who take a wider view and they include low carbon work in that, things like social care. I think ideally we need to have a bit of a broader conception of what we're talking about green jobs, or maybe even controversially to lose that label green, because when we get to a net zero world in 2050, ideally we want all jobs to be clean, to be green. And at the moment we're missing things. I think we're missing people who work in a traditional career who are maybe adding green skills to their bow. So whether that's somebody who works in a hospital but is also helping to reduce the waste or energy efficiency in their A&E. We'll also need to think about as Mika said, the people who work in industries where the industry is going to decarbonize around them, but not necessarily their job's going to change. So somebody who spray paints petrol vehicles could hopefully just be spray painting electric vehicles. I think what we need from government is to get that specificity, to talk about that framework, and then we can start seeing where the gaps are. On to like where the green jobs are. So we've done some research recently with WPI Economics that found actually that green jobs are found in those constituencies that have got the riskiest labour markets when we come out of post-COVID. I think that's why government are so keen. So particularly in places like the Red Wall, but also like the Southwest, which is obviously very overlooked. So I'd recommend people go and have a look at some of the maps that we've got that can really help you pinpoint where those jobs are happening. And similarly, we've previously done work on the circular economy that says a much greater proportion of these jobs are found in the north, in places with struggling labour markets. And hopefully we'll update those numbers soon. I think we can divide green jobs into two categories. To steal from David Goodhart, we've got the anywhere jobs and the somewhere jobs. The jobs that we're looking at recently, so whether that's in the environment, restoration, repair, recycling, and the circular economy, these really are anywhere jobs. So we need them to be in every community across the UK. Similar with home energy efficiency, boiler replacement, like it needs to happen everywhere, and we can upskill through every community. Although they do disproportionately help those, as I mentioned, with lower labour market outcomes. These are also the jobs that are less vulnerable to offshoring, which we know is a really big concern, particularly amongst Tory MPs at the moment. But government's current focus is very much on the somewhere jobs that you mentioned, Richard, places like carbon capture and storage in the Tees Valley. So really big infrastructure that creates jobs around it, but it's very much fixed in a certain place, which means some locations will do very well, but others won't necessarily see those benefits. And then finally on to the how. The problem with thinking about green jobs as a separate thing, a distinct part of our economy, is that we don't necessarily mainstream it in the way that we make policy. It means that we create a distinct set of policies to attract green jobs. And I think actually what we need to do is look at the policies that we already have and really try and mainstream green through them. So one example would be the UK Infrastructure Bank that's being set up at the moment. It's great that that's hopes to invest in net zero projects, and that will really deliver jobs. But to deliver more green jobs, it would be better if it doesn't invest in any fossil fuel projects or any harmful activities, and is solely focused on the climate and nature crisis. Similarly, with the way Treasury organises government spending, is it making sure that all government spending is aligned to our carbon and nature targets? If it is, that's really going to channel public spending and then crowd in private spending to make sure that we're really focused on green projects and therefore green jobs. Similarly, upskilling local authorities so that they can recognise opportunities in the low carbon and nature economy. They really need increased expertise and increased capacity to be able to deliver. They're in charge of skills, so we'd want to make sure they're able to actually deliver on that. And then finally, widening the scope of existing programmes and making sure they've got green strings where required. So something like the Levelling Up Fund is a great opportunity, but if we're making sure that actually that's really going to nature projects, that's really going to low carbon projects, then we're hitting two government objectives in one go, both to level up and deliver these green jobs. Similarly, with the super deduction that was announced in the March budget, which is this idea to massively increase business investment, if we're channeling that to green business investment, we're delivering green jobs, which we know are going to last longer than potentially short-term returns from other projects.
Sam, thank you very much. I should say that we do obviously encourage you to tweet about the event today on social media. The hashtag for it is GA event. I hope you continue the conversation through this event, but also beyond it. So let's open up and talk to all the panel now. And Sam, you raise an issue, which is really, I just suppose, how useful is the term green jobs? Because as you say, really, you want every part of the economy to be part of this. And I tend to have tended to think in the cliched way of wind turbine manufacturer, someone building an electric car, but actually it could be someone working in a local park. How broad a definition should we have really of green jobs that might help us in this, rather than just tunneling us down one particular line?
So the way I'm thinking about it at the moment is there's two reasons why using green jobs is potentially helpful. Is obviously the government see it as very useful, and it's helpful for us to talk in the same language in government and encourage them to help try and solve the solutions that they want to solve. But you look at Joe Biden in the US, and he doesn't use green jobs, but he's talking about green jobs. He uses good union jobs, which is it's the similar concept, but without the explicit use of green. And like I say, I think the label green ignores people who are in traditional sectors, people whose industries are decarbonising around them, people who have green skills that they're using as part of their job, but not all of it. Where I do think it is very helpful is it can really help government crystallise the jobs that it needs to massively increase to reach net zero. So if government use it as a strategic target tool to say, we need X number of green jobs and here are the green jobs that we've defined, then it's very, very good. I'm not necessarily sure whether it's the language that we want to talk to the public, much better, as Rachel can go into, but talking about the kind of work, the exact roles, and better rather than an overarching label that perhaps can put people off if they see it as politically incentivized. But certainly in terms of the way government works, the way government orientates policy, I think it is a helpful tool.
Rachel, what is driving the government's green jobs here? It's an easy thing to talk about, as we say, but is it the levelling up agenda? Is it decarbonisation? Or is it just, economic renewal, really? Or is it all of them, effectively? Or is that in danger of being slightly muddy? Oh, you're just muted at the moment, Rachel.
Sorry. You'd think that after a year of this, I'd not be falling into that trap anymore. Never mind. Yeah, so I think the fundamental source of this is that when the government committed to net zero, they and many around them were worried about how to communicate what they were doing in terms of the expenditure that it required, the potential changes that it still may require to the taxation system and behavior, in a way that made people positive about that change rather than freak out, because fundamentally something like net zero relies on public and political consent. And the reason to talk about green jobs is to emphasize the economic opportunity of net zero. So to turn it from something that is, this is going to cost you a ton of money and be really disruptive and make your life a bit more miserable, but for a good cause, to actually, not only is this a good cause, but it creates export opportunities and jobs, and you can have a better life and a better standard of living, not a worse one. So that's fundamentally what this is about politically for the government. And that's quite sensible. Like at some level, again, from the research, once you explain this to people, people are quite enthused about this idea, and they buy the idea that green jobs are a good thing and they're a better status and it could be an opportunity. I think the risk to me, and it's not just a communication risk around tangibility, it's real, is that you can make the promise and you can do the rhetoric. At some point, people will notice what job they're doing and what jobs are around them and whether they're well paid or not, right? Like, it's not something that you kind of passes them by. It's quite central. And therefore, from a policy point of view, this echoes what Sam is saying, as well as a communication point of view, it is absolutely essential that this gets really tangible and you are able to say, and therefore we are expecting in 5 years or 7 years or 10 years for people to be doing these kinds of jobs that are going to be better paid or have better progression. And this is how we are going to make them happen, or you haven't achieved your political goal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course it is. Yes, yeah.
Mika, sorry, brow, Richard, but I wasn't sure if it was because you were listening or like, what is she talking about?
No, it's just my natural expression, to be honest with you. I'm actually furrowed at the moment. Mika, you talked quite a lot about, obviously, green jobs being good jobs. Is there a particular problem in this sector at the moment, or is it just the general problem of employment not being secure and rewarding, or are there particular issues in the green economy that at the moment needs to be addressed in terms of making sure these jobs are attractive to the kind of people that Rachel talked to in her research?
Yes, there are specific issues. It's not, I'm wary of lumping everything green into one pot, because green is, as we've said, is many, many different things. So it's not that there are issues in the green sector collectively. However, a number of the bits of the economy that are required to transition have those problems. And the problems vary between different elements. So let's say offshore wind, there are some good jobs in offshore wind, far too few. But in the UK, because at the moment we're relying on importing foundations from Indonesia and nacelles from France, and basically most of it from elsewhere. But at the same time, we see, it was literally just a few weeks ago, a story came out, the Glomar Wave, which was a ship that was servicing an offshore wind farm owned by Scottish Power Renewables, which is actually a Spanish company, despite Scottish being in the name, was paying people significantly below the minimum wage on the ship. So it's not just like, a low wage, it's an illegally low wage that they were paying people. And that wasn't the first time this has happened in offshore wind in the marine sector. This happened again and again and again. So there clearly is an issue within the offshore wind sector, because it's not only happened to one company, where they are struggling because of the extent to which they're subcontracting to ensure that the workers for their contractors, subcontractors, are being paid a legal wage, let alone a decent wage. A very different issue would be retrofitting our homes. So we need to make sure that all of the UK's homes and buildings as a whole are warm, are well insulated, so we no longer have the massive energy loss that we have, particularly in the UK. And the way retrofitting at the moment, the companies that tend to do this, it's a very fragmented sector. So almost everybody who would, if you do some work insulating a loft, the company that will do it will almost certainly be either a micro firm that employs maybe 2 people, or people will all be subcontracted. Now, in those contexts, it's very difficult to ensure that actually people have a decent contract, because self-employed, or that there's decent pay levels, and in addition, or that there's skills progression and skills development, which is why actually the skills base within UK retrofitting is far lower than in Germany, for example. And the impact of that is when you get your loft insulated, it's not done right, which means that you're told that you're going to save £200 off your energy bill, and you only save 100 because they haven't done it right, which impacts your energy bill, but it also impacts the climate. So ultimately it comes back to to bite us on both levels. Another one would be heat pumps. We need to ramp up heat pump installation massively in this country. Heat pump installers at the moment tend to earn less than your gas boiler engineer. And we need to shift somehow from gas boilers to heat pumps, at least on some level. We'll also have hydrogen boilers and other things. But how do we ensure that actually those heat pump installers are, because ultimately they're probably going to need to be the gas boiler engineers, because they're going to have to take out the gas boiler that was there before. So it makes sense for it to be the same person. How do we ensure those new jobs are on the same level? And one of the issues that that we see here is that those older sectors, let's say it's gas boiler engineers or coal power plants, have been around for a while, where ultimately there was just a lot of a union presence for a long time, and that led to a kind of higher wages, that led to better job standards. And the shift into newer sectors, often we see that isn't the case, and that in the context we're in now, as opposed to 40 years ago, there were a lot of issues 40 years ago, 50 years ago, but it's easier to drive down job quality standards than it is to just maintain them or drive them up. So which is why we need government policy to be acting. And just to come back briefly on something Sam said, the point about we need to maintain mainstream green through existing policies, which is essential. But that means both green and job quality. So like the UK Infrastructure Bank, it needs to make sure that when it's putting money, let's say into renewable energy or other green infrastructure, which is necessary, that doesn't put the money into fossil fuels, that it's also making sure that we are creating jobs and good jobs in the process. Because when you look at the Green Investment Bank, we had that, it was great. They put a load of money into offshore wind. Those offshore wind farms that were financed by the Green Investment Bank, they are precisely the examples that didn't create jobs in the UK, which is what the government is trying to address now. The fact that we didn't build up those domestic supply chains, that we're relying on importing nacelles from France and foundations from Indonesia. So how do we not replicate that this time around? How do we make sure that the infrastructure is building up supply chains, so where government is putting in conditions saying, yeah, create local jobs and make sure that they're decent, good jobs in the process?
Thank you. Sam, obviously I mentioned earlier that certainly here in the northeast of England, the green jobs is the great mantra for how we're going to catch up, level up, whatever you want to call it, with other parts of the country. But obviously there's, as you say, at the moment there is an economic map which shows that green jobs often are in areas which are left behind. But also obviously the government's making deliberate strategic choices, and obviously a little bit controversial at times, of perhaps rewarding Conservative Mayor in Tees Valley with lots of investment with hydrogen, with carbon capture, with support for a free port, which is attracting jobs that may also be part of the green economy. Is there any danger in that approach of kind of the government picking winners, or is it actually quite a good strategic approach to make sure that these jobs do go to areas perhaps that need the jobs perhaps more than the kind of honeypots, the economic drivers in the southeast, for instance?
But I think there's a couple of things there. The area that we need to ramp up very quickly, that we haven't got our heads around yet, in green manufacturing, things like that. We really want to tap into existing skill bases and existing infrastructure, and a lot of that is already located in the north. So putting, like, say, we've got our carbon capture and storage trial, we've got other things going on northeast, but we need to move on to things like green steel now. So putting a green steel trial with hydrogen where there are existing steel plants makes perfect sense, because one, those communities are most at risk. Two, that's where your existing infrastructure skills lie. I think to speak to something that we were talking about earlier, the risk is if government plays green jobs as this political card, which is fine, but what that does to public opinion is, if public opinion sees it as a political project rather than the necessity to get us to net zero, we need to be very clear that actually, like I say, yes, there are particular infrastructure projects that are going to be in certain places, whether that's the northeast, whether that's elsewhere, but there are also a whole ream of other jobs that are going to be across the country, and here's how you benefit them. We need to be talking about it in the rounds for the benefits that everyone's going to get, but there are particular benefits for the communities that government is rightly focused on, whether those are the ones that are levelling up or the ones that will be potentially at risk from the transition.
I suppose all three of you, we'll open up to the Q&A in a moment, but there are dangers here, aren't there? Because I alluded to, with government intervention here, because government intervention can boost things, but can also, remove things. And I mentioned solar panels. Obviously, we have onshore wind, which was a big industry, and then the Conservatives went against it. Now slowly, perhaps slipping back to it. There are real dangers here, and again, the people you talked to, Rachel, about short-termism, short-term decisions. I mean, is it ever possible to get those kind of long-term commitments to make sure an industry is going to thrive? Because also sometimes there are obviously disagreements about what is a green job.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and it sort of comes down to trust. The example that comes up again and again in focus groups is, oh, they used to tell us that we were supposed to buy diesel cars, and now they're punishing us for it. What the hell is that about, right? That comes up so often. And it's an example of this sort of lack of trust that the directive will stick. And also, and this is perhaps less about green jobs than kind of some of the consumption-based things that need to shift with net zero, sort of this view that they will get clobbered in the end. So, if I use electric cars as an example again, people are told, get an electric car because it'll be cheaper to run, but then are you going to put road pricing on later? So is it actually going to be cheaper to run? So I think that is important sort of in general. In terms of long-termism and sort of government intervention, we've been talking about, the green economy is another word for the economy, right? Because we're trying to rewire the entire economy. So it's broad and difficult to define. If we kind of narrow down to what I think we've been talking about quite a bit in the last few minutes, which is industrial sectors of manufacturing. These are based on incredibly long-term investment cycles. They're very, very expensive, and they unquestionably require stable tax and incentive environments if you want any private sector funding to go into them. So, one of the big live debates right now in policy terms, which is absolutely essential to some of these green jobs, is, should we have a border carbon adjustment? Should we have tax incentive systems in place so that industry knows it can invest without major risk of offshoring, which will lead to job losses, let alone job gain? That's a very long way of saying that for quite a few of these sectors, in the absence of long-term signals, it's just not going to happen. So that seems, and you have to make some choices, or it's just not going to happen because people need to know what they're investing in. There are others, and I'll go back to retail, for example, where it's likely to be much more flexible. You're going to get far more actors making far more decisions. You're going to get lots and lots of different experiments in terms of what we do and how. And I think it's much easier then to see how things kind of emerge. So I mean, the truth is it depends on which sector you're talking about, but there are some where long-term signals are a necessary precondition if we want to hit net zero.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, let's get.
Can I just throw in just to follow on?
Yeah, of
from
course.
it,
Yeah, yes.
That
sorry.
I completely agree, and about in the absence of long-term signals, it won't happen in a lot of those sectors. And I think what we can see is that in other countries, those signals exist. So in Sweden, SSAB, Swedish steel company, supported by the Swedish government, is putting money into hydrogen-produced steel, hydrogen reduction for steel. In Canada, we're seeing more car factories switching to EVs. And Germany, France, the US, this is quite standard to have long-term industrial strategy, long-term industrial policies where government says, this is our role. Industry, you're over there. Here's how we'll give you that long-term view. Here's where you might need a bit of support or investment. Here's where you need guarantees on the kind of pathway and everything. It's not a rare thing to exist in the world. It's just rare in the UK. And maybe if we want to be showing climate leadership, and if we want our industries to be leading in the future, to be competitive, whether it's steel, whether it's offshore wind, whether it's CCS, whether it's EVs, then we need to be able to compete by having that long-term guarantee. Otherwise, we're just going to be at the back of the pack.
I guess I generally completely agree with that. I would just say mildly in the UK's defence, they did pioneer the use of CFDs, and that has driven faster renewable energy increase than pretty much anywhere else. And it was a long-term structure. So we are perfectly capable of it when we put our mind to it. But that's maybe a minor quibble.
And we need to introduce jobs into it as well as building the turbines.
Okay, well, let's get some questions. James from Green Alliance has been looking at our questions and can hopefully fire some at the panel that have come from the people taking part today.
Thanks very much, Richard, and thanks to everyone who submitted questions before or during this event. To kick us off, I'd like to make the most of my privilege as the question handler to ask a question of my own, and this is directed to Rachel, but I'd be interested to hear what Mika and Sam have to say as well. Rachel, we spoke earlier about how the government can better communicate green jobs to the public by plugging that communications gap and unpacking this complex and abstract terminology. But how can the public, and in our case, civil society, communicate green jobs to the government and MPs, particularly in mind?
How can the public do it?
Civil society, so NGOs. How can we speak to MPs who might be more reticent to talk about green issues and make them feel more confident to talk about green issues and also green jobs in Parliament and with their constituents?
I think it's a great question. Fundamentally, in my experience, people who are reticent about talking about green issues are worried about two things. The first is cost. What will be the cost to consumers? And therefore, what is it that I'm asking my constituents to bear? And the second is job loss. So going back to the offshoring question, will this mean, this is how many of them would think about it. It comes up again a lot in focus groups. Will this mean that the UK does the right thing, China does not, it takes all the manufacturing jobs and we've just lost out and this is a massive global issue? So those are the two fundamental risks in the mind of people who remain quite worried about net zero and what it involves. Going back to really, I think, both this research and the need for government policy, making it extremely concrete how policy and the shift, is number one, is going to create good, particularly manufacturing jobs. I think that's really central in the political mind and MPs' minds. And protect jobs here, I think it really, really matters. So I think being very, very concrete about that and what it offers is absolutely central. I think the other thing that I would say, and it kind of links to what we've been talking about, is this is happening. America is now fully on board. All of the financial investment is going into green. The private sector is moving. If Britain doesn't lead the way, it will lose out now. This is not a choice that the UK can really make. It's a global choice that is increasingly being made. And the question is, how do we make it tangible and get the greatest opportunities from it rather than lose from it? And again, this comes back to green jobs. But I think that is sometimes not really understood in my experience, that if we suddenly decide, actually we're climate skeptics, like that's not going to work anymore in this current global environment. So, and look, most politicians get that, but I think it is important to set as a baseline.
And I just add on top of that, I think we need to recognise that we've come a long place from people not talking about green as a political penalty. You look at the Queen's speech recently, and we were flicking through Hansard after the first day of debate, which is all about the economy, all about the recovery. And it was just dominated by interventions on both sides of the aisle of people talking about green jobs, green job creation, green industrial revolution. And that's fantastic. I think what we need now is, as Rachel, as we've all said, is like, what does that actually mean in practice for MPs? What do they need to do to be able to do that? And perhaps a bit of the education understanding of what green jobs actually looks like for them to push on the policy that's going to bring it in.
Thanks. Looking at some of the questions that came in before this event, there's one for Sam. Sam, how aware are young people of green job opportunities out there, and how easy are they for young people to access?
This is an interesting one. So we did, some of the focus groups that we did with Rachel and Public First were specifically with graduates, people who were fresh in their careers. And there's this real sense of, I wish I'd known about this earlier. They'd made career paths, whether they were in dentistry, whether they were in nursing or whatever, which was pretty fixed and was quite hard then to move into green careers. So I think, particularly if government is thinking about horizons up to 2050, we need a real focus on careers education, reflecting the green skills, the green jobs that we're going to want in the future, whether that's through the Careers and Enterprise organisation pushing those things, whether that's through supporting universities, supporting technical colleges to advertise courses as green and ensure the content of those courses is actually green and it's not just greenwashing. We talk a lot about, and the debate is really focused on reskilling, which is good because it's a really big, meaty political problem, but I think it also obscures this need to talk to younger people early about either either moving into a green career or the sort of green skills you can have in an existing career that you may also be interested in.
Thanks, Sam. One last question that was submitted in advance is, do you think businesses and industry truly understand the urgency and scale of action required on green jobs? Perhaps Mika would like to start with that one.
I didn't quite catch the last part of it. Can you say the last part of it again?
Yeah. Do you think businesses and industry truly understand the urgency and scale of action required on green jobs?
I mean, obviously there's a range of businesses and industry. I think it varies, but there's also a question whether they understand it and whether they're prepared to act on it and whether they feel able to act on it. And I guess this connects to the points that we've said about what is government's role in creating a framework where industry will invest. Like, you could turn around and go, the steel industry hasn't invested into clean steel in the UK. Now, is that because the executives of those companies didn't think it was important, or was it because they didn't feel like, as a company, they could make that investment and they'd be able to? I mean, steel is already struggling for a range of different issues in this country. For me, it's less about, well, why are they, like, it's going, what are the limitations to industry putting that investment in? And sometimes it might just be that they're a bit hesitant, that they're stuck in their existing routes. Let's say oil and gas industry has obviously known about climate change for decades, and talked a good talk about renewables for a long time, but was quite slow to put money in. I'd say that was just because of the culture space within that industry. However, at this stage, where everybody should be realizing the scale of the climate crisis, it's also about going, what does the industry need to deliver? And sometimes the industry and businesses are able to just step up and do it themselves. Sometimes they need a framework. Sometimes it's about how do you work collectively. And then it also comes back to, like, the point Rachel was making about how do you set the international trade agreements so that and what do you do about carbon leakage, that we're not offshoring the jobs after putting the investment in here.
I think just a very quick follow-up to that. Different sectors have different needs, as Mika said, and a lot of businesses are asking, it's like, what do government want us to do? And there's a lot of things we're still waiting for from government that can help with that. So whether that's the heat and building strategy, whether that's more on vehicles, whether that's Treasury's net zero view that's going to say the economic costs and benefits and how they're going to distribute that. These sort of strategy documents are hugely important for business, but then also the things that go alongside that, sort of the annual regulation, the targets, something like a Z mandate to make sure that we're really getting close towards the electric vehicle production that we need. Those sort of things can help businesses who know there's a problem really act on it.
And not ditching, like, the green homes. Having green homes grant set up and then cutting it means that the businesses that were prepared to step up are like, oh, okay, we need to let our employees go again.
Turning now to the Q&A box, one of the top upvoted questions is from Henry Leveson-Gower. Henry asks, should we be talking about green skills rather than green jobs? After all, most jobs could be greener with the right skills. This is also more inclusive. Perhaps Rachel would like to start that one.
So I think it depends what you're trying to achieve. I think it makes a lot of sense to be talking to everyone about green skills and how their jobs are going to become greener. But kind of going back again to sort of why it is that politicians talk about green jobs in the first place. It is about trying to articulate a new positive opportunity that is economic as well as sort of moral necessary, that has upside advantage as well as avoiding downside risk. That's the kind of core of why it is that they're driven to do this. And I do think that continues to be important. Hopefully in 40 years, we won't be talking green, right? Like, because it'll just be the baseline of our economy and none of this will sort of matter at some level. But right now, there is still a need to articulate that upside opportunity, I think. So you do need both, with my view.
And I think also, as Rachel's research points out, like, there are job references, there are jobs where the skills remain identical. Like if you work in a shop selling secondhand clothes, or you work in a retail shop selling new clothes, actually, I mean, that obviously they're not identical, but a lot of the jobs for working in a green job are not about green skills. There are crucial green skills, but a lot of them are just about the job itself as part of decarbonising. And actually, I might just I think it relates to this question that there's sometimes a risk with the skills point that we assume that because a job has more skills, that therefore it's better quality, and lower skill jobs are lower quality, and that's not actually necessarily the case. So you can have a highly, I mean, obviously this question, like I would say care work is highly skilled, even though it's often designated not that, but you can have jobs that are widely agreed to be high quality and actually contract conditions are terrible. You can have a job that is widely seen as lower skilled and they've got decent pay and decent conditions and a good contract, and we shouldn't assume that the skills leads to the quality, basically.
Sorry,
Rachel. Sorry.
No. Maybe it's tangential, but I do think it's important to remember. And there's a quote in the report from someone that a good job is the primary consideration for people, and everything else is secondary. So I think one person said, if there was a choice between working in a tobacco plant and a green job, and the tobacco plant paid me twice as much, I might feel slightly guilty about it, but I'm going to go and work in the tobacco plant because that's going to give me a better life for my family. So I'm just echoing what Mika said. That is the primary consideration for people, is economic security. Everything else falls from that until you're in a relatively privileged position where you're above a certain floor, but most people aren't, and you have to remember that.
Another question from the Q&A box is from Ben Reynolds. Ben asks, what role did the panel see for food and farming amongst the green jobs agenda, particularly as it is currently missing from the government's 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution?
Yes, I mean, it's a huge part, and this goes to the debate that we've been having about the difference between jobs and skills, in that actually we're going to need an awful lot of farmers and people who work in the natural environment still, but the way they do their work, the technology they use is going to change, and their practices are going to change. So we're going to have to upskill people in sustainable agriculture, or people doing ecosystem services trade, like recognizing that land management improvements, how you buy, how you sell, that is going to be an additional skill to a farmer's work set, but it's not necessarily going to mean that job isn't still there. I mean, Mika can speak to how the natural environment jobs are being involved in the Green Jobs Task Force, because I know it's something that both DEFRA and BEIS are really struggling with. It's often the forgotten thing. I think one of the things that we need to talk about as a sector we're starting to move towards is actually how do you get the private investment into these sectors that are going to create the jobs that we need. That's ongoing, but like I say, it's making sure we're really clear to people that actually you can upskill, you can improve the work you do. We're not throwing whole sectors under the bus.
Just because Sam referenced the Green Jobs Task Force, I mean, it was a struggle to bring in agriculture and food and farming. It was also interesting that it was us as a trade union organization where there's not that many members within food and farming, and nonetheless we kept going, we need to talk about agriculture, but there just wasn't very much attention coming to it, which I guess comes to a challenge in terms of how to integrate it, and also the wider focus on how does it fit in.
And some of the jobs that we looked at for our work with WPI, the natural environment restoration jobs, they're very much in sustainable land practices, sort of natural environment restoration, peatland restoration. Like, we mustn't forget about all those jobs as well. And those are some of the ones that we specifically tested when we're talking to people through the focus groups. And there's really interest in doing those things. Again, if the working conditions are right, and there's this sort of skepticism, working outdoors, hard work. So there are sometimes additional barriers to some of the natural environment work. So actually talking about there are other roles, working in project management or doing research and development like they do at Swansea with the seagrass. There's loads of other roles and skills available in environmental work, rather than just, I think, the top level that comes to people's minds when we talk about them.
I'm just going to step in there because we're running short of time. So unfortunately, there's loads of good questions there. There's some fantastic points being made in the chat as well. And this is an education to me as a journalist, as much as it is, I'm sure, to a lot of people who are listening, to the panellists, as well as the information in the chat. So we're just going to round up with a couple of final comments from each three of the panellists. And I suppose I'd also want you to reflect on how optimistic we should be as to whether we are on the verge of a kind of green revolution in jobs, or maybe there's a lot more work to do here. Let's start with Rachel.
I'll do optimism first, which is that if you had asked me 5 years ago if you would have seen this much increase in public support for action on the environment, and indeed this much global collective action, I would have been very, very skeptical. So I think we should be impressed by how far we've come. I also don't think we should underestimate the challenge ahead. And I don't just mean the challenge in terms of actually decarbonising these industries, but in moving from general but quite soft public support to extremely tangible public support to the changes that are happening. And this is why I think this report matters, which is getting that right, the substance of it and the language of it, is going to be critical if you actually want to hit your net zero targets in the next few decades, because this is the ultimate or sort of example of a series of policy changes that rest on public consent. And we've all seen examples of messy elections in other countries. It is remarkable to me right now that we don't have a highly green skeptic sort of right-wing party that's emerging. It probably will at some point, as it has in other places. And therefore, making sure that you have the policy and the language to back up the promises is going to be the difference between success and failure.
Thank you, Rachel. Mika.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the scary threat, basically, that things go wrong, we get the backlash, and then we get that climate skeptic, more right-wing party kind of shaping a lot of the public position, and that's what we really, really, really need to avoid. And I think there is a risk at the moment, and it's not just about government, but there's a risk at the moment from government, also green organizations and media framing around it, that we tell one story that is different from what is happening and what is going to happen, and that creates the conditions for people to go, well, you promised something and you really, really, really haven't delivered on that, and now we're pushing back against that. So I think there's a significant risk of not delivery, but I would say that what's quite interesting, if we look at the US, is look at what the US government is doing now in terms of accelerating very rapidly a significant scale up in terms of investment in growing green jobs and green economy. Compare that to what we were seeing coming out of the US last year and the year before. It is possible to accelerate quickly, to change things around and to put those policy measures into place. I think that shows very much we can do it here. We just need to run with it.
Thanks, Sam.
Yeah, likewise, very much in the optimistic side. I think I'd encourage everyone to just put green jobs into Hansard and look at the number of references over the past 5 years, and it's like exponential increase of people talking about it, which is fantastic. And we've got from the Queen's speech the other day, we've got some fantastic opportunities coming up with the lifetime skills pledge and technical education. There's going to be real opportunities to push this sort of stuff, and as soon as we get the private finance flowing, some of the stuff that we've talked about here about long-termism, making sure the industry knows what it needs to deliver, that's when you start to get really rapid feedbacks, and things like we've seen with the fall of the renewable energy price, we can see that across various net zero sectors. So I think everything's trending in the right direction, but I wouldn't be working for an NGO if I wouldn't go, but there's more to do. Partly we've just got to get on with the implementation now. Like, things are going to become tangible to the public, for good or for bad. Whether you're putting in a new boiler, they're going to notice it, or whether they've got a new job in the green industry. And we've got to really make sure that we are managing that very carefully.
Sam, Rachel, Mika, thank you very much. Thanks very much to Green Alliance for organising this event. It'll be fascinating to do this again in a few months, a year time, when hopefully the pandemic isn't quite as big an issue as it is now, and find out where we are and just what differences have actually happened and we've seen. This event is being recorded, as you saw, and will be available on the Green Alliance's YouTube channel later. And again, you can continue the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag GA event. But thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to everybody who joined today. As I said, some fantastic questions and also comments in there in the chat and information, links to various bits and pieces which I'm keen to pursue. Thank you for joining us today. Sorry we didn't get to all your questions, but hopefully we'll be back again, maybe in person one time, with the delights of Zoom. And being variable, I'm afraid, as I've experienced as a broadcaster. But today all worked. Thank you very much. Bye now.